Back. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. We are continuing our study of the Olivet Discourse. We are now focused, after a good bit of study, on the parable of the absent master. We are focused on the parable of the coming of the Son of Man with the angels to sit on the throne of his glory, to gather the nations. And of course, we are told this is absolutely proof positive. Since it's the gathering of the nations, and all the nations were not gathered in AD 70, that must mean, oh look, AD 70 could not have been the fulfillment of this passage. Now, as I have said many, many times, and I pointed it out on Facebook and YouTube yesterday and this morning, one individual, nice guy, he was commenting on 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. Which, of course, has to do with the resurrection, the coming of the Lord on the clouds with the angels, with a shout, with the trumpet, etc. And he says, even a casual reading of this passage reveals very quickly that it has not been fulfilled. Well, my response to that was, and I would apply what I'm about to say to Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following. My response to that was, your, quote, casual reading of the text and other similar texts is based upon your presupposition, your a priori view that says, or that is based upon a Western, Occidental, not accidental, Grecian world view, which is radically different in its approach to literature from the Hebraic, apocalyptic worldview. Therefore, when you sit down and write, well, look, even a casual reading says that hasn't happened, you are assuming that that passage, whatever it might be, must be interpreted from a rigidly literalistic perspective. And that is not the way to do proper hermeneutic. We must see that language is written within a cultural, historical, social, religious milieu, context. And to approach that language outside of that context is to do a misservice to the language itself. So when we come to Joel, when we come to Matthew chapter 25, and people say, well, look, this is about the gathering of all the nations. That didn't happen in AD 70. Therefore, it very clearly is not fulfilled. We are assuming something about our cosmological view of the world versus the cosmological view of Scripture itself and the first century context. Not only the first century, but the ancient, before that, perspective of that kind of language. Now, with that introductory bit before us, let me point out, and this happened just this last week, one objector to my appeal to Joel chapter 2 and chapter 3 said, well, you know, there are many places in the Old Testament in which God said something was at hand. It was near. It was coming soon. But we know it hasn't happened yet, century upon century upon century later. Therefore, that tells us God doesn't speak in time words, time language like we do. After all, one day is with the Lord 1,000 years as a day. Now, I can understand why people make that argument. It goes back to reading the Scripture from that Grecian worldview that says, oh, this hasn't happened literally yet. Therefore, at hand doesn't mean at hand. You see, all of these things are intertwined with each other. So, in Joel chapter 3, verse 14 and 15, the Lord spoke through Joel and said, the day of the Lord is near. In the valley of decision, the sun and moon will grow dark. The stars will diminish their brightness. The Lord will also roar from Zion and utter his voice from Jerusalem. The heaven and the earth will shake, but the Lord will be a shelter for his people and the strength of the children of Israel. So you shall know that I, the Lord your God, dwelling in Zion, my holy mountain, then Jerusalem shall be holy. A holy mountain, then Jerusalem shall be holy, and no alien shall ever pass through her again. Pardon me. So here we have it. Joel, and depending on where you date Joel, some date it as early as the 9th century AD, some place it prior to the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. It's somewhat difficult to determine. So here we have a prediction of the day of the Lord. And Joel was told, the day of the Lord is near in the valley of decision. Well, the day of the Lord hasn't come yet, and we are almost 3,000 or at least 2,500 years after Joel wrote. Therefore, God doesn't talk in time like we do. The very first time I heard that argument, I realized there are two things going on here. Number one is the assumption that the, quote, day of the Lord always refers to the, quote, end of time. My argument is it never refers to an end of time, but that's another discussion. But you see, I was raised in a religious environment, context that said the day of the Lord is always the end of time. I had no concept otherwise. And so when I very first read Joel chapter 2 and 3, I was like, whoa, hang on here. Boy, that was written a long time ago, and the day of the Lord hasn't come. Well, I made the mistake, at least it's a mistake according to some people. Biblically, it's only the proper thing to do. I made the mistake of doing a word study of the term day of the Lord. I made the mistake, again, according to some people, because of where it's led me, I made the mistake of studying the language of, the sun and the moon will go dark, the stars will diminish their brightness, etc. In other words, this decreation language. I looked at every single occurrence in the Old Testament. And I realized that, number one, the term day of the Lord referred to many occasions in the Old Testament in which God, in his sovereignty, utilized this nation over here to punish, to destroy, or to judge this nation over here. Then I discovered that when Yahweh used this nation over here to judge this nation over here, it was said he came on the clouds of heaven. What? That was earth-shattering to me. That was paradigm changing to me. And you go to Isaiah chapter 19, behold, the Lord rides on a swift cloud into Egypt, and the Nile shall be dried up, and all the fish shall disappear, and there won't be any birds in the heavens. And I mean, wow, that had to be the end of time, day of the Lord. Oh, but wait. Chapter 20, and no, there's not a chapter division in the Hebrew text. It tells us that Sargon, the king of the Assyrians, would bring about this destruction. Well, wait a minute. Sargon is way dead. All of this happened in the 8th century BC. Did the Lord literally, visibly, bodily ride a physical cumulus cloud out of heaven, come into Egypt? Well, no, he didn't. But you see, this is typical Hebraic language to describe an act of God within history, to describe God's sovereign action. He rode on the clouds. You ought to read Psalm 78. You ought to read Psalm 68. You ought to read Psalms 105 and 104. Yahweh rode on the clouds. That's just apocalyptic language. The second thing I discovered was when I realized that this language of the sun being darkened, the moon not giving its light, and the sun falling from the sky and similar type of expressions, it was speaking, once again metaphorically, it was speaking of the end of their world. In Isaiah chapter 13, that very identical kind of language is used in reference to the day of the Lord that was coming at the hands of the Assyrians and that happened within 15 years. And then the ultimate destruction at the hand of the Medes and the Persians. Now, what I discovered was when the Lord predicted this day of the Lord, the sun being turned to darkness, the moon to blood, etc., and when it was said that it was at hand, it really was at hand. But then I discovered something else. And this is found very graphically in Joel. In Joel chapter 1, verse 15. And actually we could, go prior to that. But nonetheless, Joel 1:15. Alas, for the day of the Lord is at hand. It shall come as destruction from the Almighty. Is not the food cut off before our eyes, joy and gladness from the house of our God? You see, at the day of the Lord, it would be a time of famine. Wait a minute. Why point out that there's going to be a day of the Lord at which there would be famine if the day of the Lord is an earth-burning, time-ending event that is over in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye? You don't have time for a famine. In chapter 2, blow the trumpet in Zion, sound an alarm in my holy mountains, let all the inhabitants of the land flee, for the day of the Lord is coming, it is at hand, a day of darkness and gloominess, a day of clouds and thick darkness, like the morning clouds spread over the mountains. A people will come great and strong, the like of whom has never been, nor will there ever be any such after them, even for many successive generations. Now, wait a minute. Here's a day of the Lord at which armies come, and there will be nothing like this for many generations to come. Well, wait a minute. Once again, if the day of the Lord is an earth-burning, time-ending, cosmos-destroying event, how can there be generations to come? And here we have the definition of a day of the Lord as an invasion by an army. Well, what does that have to do with the Lord coming out of heaven on a literal cloud? And this was all at hand. We're told this, Joel chapter 2. Notice the language. The earth quakes before them. Before whom? This army that's coming. The heavens tremble. Look, folks, how would the literal heavens tremble at the coming of an army? That doesn't work. The sun and the moon grow dark, and the stars diminish their brightness. The Lord gives voice before his army. His camp is very great. Strong is the one who executes his word. For the day of the Lord is great and very terrible. Who can endure it? But once again, you see, ladies and gentlemen, we are emphatically told this is at the time of an invasion of Zion by an army. And it was near when Joel wrote. Oh, but wait, and I got to hurry here. Joel 2, verse 28. And it shall come to pass afterward. After what? After this previous day of the Lord that was at hand. Do you catch the power of that? In this previous language, we have a day of the Lord, a day of the Lord that was at hand, a day of the Lord that was an invasion by an army at which the material creation would be shaken, the sun darkened, etc. And then in 2:28, we have language that says, after that day of the Lord, there would be another day of the Lord. And here's what's amazing. In chapter 3, 1 and 2, that day of the Lord, which is described in Joel 2:28 and following, would be in the last days, and it would be in those days and at that time. At what time? The last days. At what time? After this day of the Lord of chapter 1 and 2, after that day of the Lord, in the last days, there will be another day of the Lord. When the last days arrive, this other day of the Lord, that would be after that one, in the last days, this day of the Lord will be at hand. You see, in chapter 1 and 2, we're not told that Joel was living in the last days. Nope. He wasn't in the last days. He was living in a time of an imminent day of the Lord that is described as the sun being darkened, moon turning to blood, the cosmos being destroyed, and he was predicting another day of the Lord for the last days. And when the last days arrived, the day of the Lord, when the sun, the moon, the stars would be affected. And in those days, and at that time, the day of the Lord would be near. Now, look, folks, this is what, for lack of terminology, this is what I have labeled, projected imminence. The writer is first of all speaking of events in his day and his time, and then he is projected into another day, another time, far off, in other words, and in the last days. And when the last days would finally come, the events of the last days would be at hand, coming soon, shortly, and quickly. It is absolutely misguided to go to Joel and to go to Joel 3:14 and 15 and say, the Lord said the day of the Lord was at hand, and we know the day of the Lord hadn't come. There are two things. Remember, the objector is assuming the day of the Lord is an earth-burning, time-ending, age-ending event. Number two, they're ignoring the explicit language of the text that says, here's the day of the Lord that's imminent. Here's another day of the Lord that's far off after this one. And when those last days arrive, then that day, that great and terrible day of the Lord will be at hand. Out of time for this morning. Thanks so much for joining me on this morning's Morning Musings. I'll see you on the flip side.